And they don't justify the conclusion in any simple deterministic sense. You know, I met a woman once in my clinical practice, man, this was something. She was as damaged a person as you could hope to contemplate. So she looked like a street person. She'd come to this behavior therapy clinic that I worked in as a student, and she was dressed like a street person. You know, she had this old ratty winter jacket on that was really dirty, and she stooped over. She wasn't very tall to begin with. She stooped over, hunched over, and she approached everyone like this, which made people shy away from her because it's an odd method of approach. But the reason she did that was she was really so timid and so humble that it was as if anybody that she approached had a light that was emanating from them too unbearable for her to behold. So it wasn't so much an oddity, although it was, as a preternatural humility. And I thought she had come to the behavior clinic because she wanted help. She was an outpatient at a psychiatric hospital that I worked at. And she couldn't communicate very well, partly because of her shyness, partly because her first language was French, which maybe she could communicate perfectly well in French, but I doubt it. She was not an intelligent person, technically speaking. You know, she was intellectually impaired, and probably in the bottom 10th percentile of the population. That's a pretty rough place to exist cognitively. You know, you're barely literate at that point. And her mother was very ill and was bedridden, and her mother had a boyfriend who was a violent alcoholic schizophrenic who was always haranguing her about Satan. And man, she had a rough life. She just didn't have anything going for her. She wasn't an attractive person physically, you know, and people shied away from her. She just was the downtrodden of the earth, you know, in the realist sense. And that bloody woman, you know, she actually came to that behavior therapy clinic. She'd been an inpatient. And this was a rough place, man, because it was a hospital after deinstitutionalization, and there were tunnels connecting some of the wards to other wards because it's so cold. This was in Montreal. It's so cold in the winter. They built a hospital on these tunnels, and I took my brother there one day, and it was like walking through Dante's Inferno. I mean, if you were so psychiatrically impaired that you weren't released in the 1980s when deinstitutionalization was maybe at its peak, you were so damaged that there was just no possibility that you could function in the outside world. So the people that were left were sort of the most demolished of the most demolished. And so just walking through there for my brother, who had no experience in such things, was traumatizing, you know. And she had been in the inpatient ward for some time and then was released, and she wanted to talk to the hospital administration because she got out and she got this dog that she took care of and went for a walk, and she really liked this dog and she took care of it, you know, and she walked with it, and she wanted to see if she could go find one of those inpatients who was worse off than her and take them for a walk every day with her dog. You know, it's so funny, you meet someone like that and they just have nothing. They have nothing in the world that you would recognize as any marker of success or status or ability, or they're outcast and tortured, and then nonetheless, you know, a woman in that dismal state was able to rise above her own catastrophe, which was like manifold, and find someone worse off to try to serve. You know, you don't need many experiences like that to convince you that there's things about the world that you truly don't understand on the ethical front, you know. So I would say, when you're at the crossroads and you're counseled to despair, you know, rise up in courage and see if you can resist it. It's better for you and it's better for the people around you. So that's the flood, man. And so the story that follows that is the Tower of Babel. You know, I was reading a Wikipedia article on the Tower of Babel the other day. I'm always curious about how these things are represented most publicly, right? And Wikipedia is a great way to do that because it's collectively edited. And the interpretation was essentially, it was the description of how the languages of the world arose. And I don't think that's what that story is about at all, except peripherally. I thought, yeah, you just missed the point 100%. I mean, Babel is Babylon first, so you need to know that. And Babylon is the state that's gone mad. And it's a continual temptation for human beings to build complex organizations, right, that get too high. And so what does that mean? How about too many layers? Not local enough, not distributed enough, right? Too separate from the people that they serve. I think the EU did that. I think that's why the British left. That's the Tower of Babel. In fact, unbelievably, they used a famous painting of the Tower of Babel as a representation of the EU in some of their literature, which I think it was a painting by Bruegel, but I'm not sure of that. But that was just like, okay. I just do not understand how that happened at all. In any case, this Tower of Babel, it's also a Luciferian story. You know, Lucifer is the spirit of intellect, the light bringer, who's flown too high and challenges God himself and falls. And in Milton's story, Lucifer is called on his pretension by God and said, you know, because he is God's highest angel, God most catastrophically wrong. So a symbol of intellect, that in combination with the notion that he's a light bringer, it's a symbol of prideful intellect. And it is the prideful intellect that raises itself against what is most properly placed at the highest place, which is what God is, whatever that is. Whatever it is, it's not the intellect. That's a subordinate spirit. And if it isn't, then it becomes aimed essentially at something approximating hell and perfectly capable of creating it and then perfectly capable of ruling in it. And so when God calls Lucifer on his rebellion, he says, if you but repent, you could be welcomed home. And Lucifer says, well, I am the sort of spirit that even if I once repented, I would be instantly tempted to merely repeat my mistake. And he says as well, I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. It's like, hey man, there's a choice for you at the crossroads. And so, you know, people have asked me, for example, I'm very opposed to the idea that the fundamental human motivation is power, which is pretty much what every student is taught at every level of their education, in every educational institution, except a handful now across your country. Fundamental motivation is power. There's no place for people of goodwill to meet and engage in constructive dialogue, dialogos, none of that, because our fundamental motivation is nothing but the will to power. And so there is no place for people of goodwill to meet. There is no such thing as dialogue. It's all a mask, a rationalization, a post hoc rationalization for pretension and power. It's such a dismal philosophy. It's so, you could not, and I believe this technically, you could not formulate a more pathological philosophy. It obliterates your faith in society, and it eradicates the notion of the individual. It removes the notion of good faith and goodwill, and it makes communication impossible. It's like, that's a temptation to engage in that sort of destruction as a consequence of your intellectual pretensions, let's say. And for all of you, this is going to face you too, this pretension, you know. So maybe you're not the hopeless type, and the temptation that assails you at the crossroads isn't your degeneration into a kind of faithless nihilism. Maybe it's a self-aggrandizement in some sense instead, and that you feel that now you have the opportunity to serve your own ambition. Well, we could take apart what that means, because I think it's worthwhile. Psychopaths serve their own ambition. And they're the people who are most truly motivated by power, by the way, if you think about it clinically. And they're not very successful, all protestations to the contrary. They never rise above about 3% of any general population. And maybe it's a better strategy to be a manipulative psychopath than to lay inert in your bed, in your mother's bedroom when you're 40, but it's not an optimal strategy. And so you can get away with it being a psychopath because you can mimic competence and you can take advantage of people who have learned to expect the best from others, and so you can manipulate them. But you produce nothing on your own. And one of the things that's really interesting about psychopaths is they don't learn from experience, which means not only do they betray other people constantly, but they betray their own future selves. And there's really no difference between your future self and someone else, right? You know, if you're going to act ethically, and this is a very good way of thinking about acting ethically, you act in a way that works for you now, that works for you tomorrow, that works for you next week and next month and next year and in 5 years and in 10 years, and for you and your family and your friends and your broader community, and all of that simultaneously. And that's a place to find purpose in your life, to manage that balancing act simultaneously, and to sacrifice your narrow, self-oriented pretensions, ambition, all of that, the celebration of your own intellect, the construction of your own empire for your own narrow purposes. Part of the reason you shouldn't do that, even though it's tempting in some sense, especially if you have the ability, is because, do you want to rule over hell? I mean, And that's another interesting question with regards to the question of whether power is a valid motivation. It's like, okay, well, Kim Jong-un, let's take Kim. He's a manifestation of a power player. You think it's better to be leader of North Korea than to be just an ordinary peon there? Are you so sure it's better to rule over hell than just to be a servant in hell? It's not obvious to me. That's not success by any stretch of the imagination. The most powerful devil. That's like the worst possible failure. And so, you're called upon to take the lessons that you've been taught in a university like this, that attempts to teach you to abide by the eternal verities, to sacrifice your own narrow pretensions in the highest sense to something that's truly better, not because you should in some finger-wagging sense, but because there is truly nothing better, and perhaps you don't have the wisdom to see that, because it's difficult to see. It's difficult to have a purview broad enough to encompass those expanse of time and community and see what pattern of behavior is to be manifested in proper service to balance all of that in some musical manner. But that's definitely the appropriate pathway.